Before the scientific revolution took hold, people in those days looked to the church to explain the mysteries of the earthly world. Frightening occurrences such as paralysis, a sudden seizure, or a baby born ill or disfigured left people looking for an explanation, and preferably someone to blame. The church preached about the devil and considered witches to be their willing disciples. It therefore became the duty of the church to find and condemn them. The Catholic Church was already well equipped and prepared for hunting and, shall we say, purifying non-believers. By this time, due to its persecution and crusades against heretics, both abroad and in Europe by the medieval Inquisition during the late 12th and 13th centuries. Mingling witchcraft with heresy was just a step away. The idea of witchcraft or sorcery was changing. Anything that hinted at spiritual insight or power not under the church's umbrella was considered to be of demonic origin. The concept of demonic possession became inextricably linked to witchcraft in these societies back then. The power of persuasion was strong, and there were constant accusations of possession by the church. Fear of evil and enigmatic forces were some of the driving causes behind both witch hunts and declarations of possession. There were also many instances of women themselves claiming to be possessed, which didn't help the situation at all. It wasn't uncommon for someone to be accused of heresy if thought to be involved in witchcraft practices. Consider the infamous trial of Joan of Arc to illustrate the precarious superstitious atmosphere of medieval Europe preceding the mass witch hunts, and the position of women in general who defied the expectations of their place in religious matters, and of anyone for that matter who claimed communion with God beyond the church's control. During the 100 Years' War between England and France, at the height of British dominance over the French, British territory included most of northern France, Brittany, and Gascony in the southwest. French morale was shattered as British forces were besieging the city of Orléans. A young peasant girl claimed to hear the voice of God telling her to save France. The so-called Maid of Orléans set off to meet with the Dauphin, the eldest son of the king and heir to the throne. After already rallying French troops and restoring their morale, she was allowed to visit with the future king after being interrogated by various prelates who were wary of heresy. She was able to locate the French heir unmarked among his courtiers, even though she had never seen him before. The English siege of Orléans began in October 1428 and lasted 7 months. Joan of Arc broke it in 7 days. Through stubborn diplomacy and as an inspiring leader in battle, she paved the way for Charles to be crowned King at Reims, and essentially saved France from British rule, which in turn consolidated its monarchy and cultural identity. One of the most courageous women of French history, she was captured and burned at the stake as a heretic by the British and their Burgundian allies on May 30th, 1431. The executioner himself swore that at the moment of her death, a white dove took wing toward France, and that her heart would not burn. The charges against her also included witchcraft, and that of violating divine law by dressing like a man. In 1920, she was named a saint, the only person to ever be both condemned and canonized by the Catholic Church. Her visions and miracles remain mysteries to this day, no better explained than by those who knew her best. A few years later, and the goal of identifying and removing witches received a public boost when German authors Jacob Sprenger and Heinrich Kramer released their book Malleus Maleficarum in the late 1400s, translated as The Hammer of Witches. The book openly stated 3 cardinal ideas. Number 1, witches exist. Number 2, they can be identified by certain behaviors. And number 3, even a common man can identify them. The book went viral in a medieval way. The church sanctioned it and practically outright initiated public hunts for witches and sorcerers. People who were often social outcasts, misfits, irreligious, or pagan. The phenomenon of witch hunting then kicked off in the 15th century, apparently first in southern France, and later in other parts of Europe and England. It's interesting to note that about 2 centuries earlier, Pope Innocent III sent out a Catholic crusade against the Cathars, a sect of Christianity prominent in the Languedoc, also in southern France. As the bestseller, the Malleus Maleficarum, spread, Germany began to lead the way with having tried and executed the most witches during the peak of the mass psychosis. After the Reformation of 1536, witches were burned more frequently in Denmark too. This practice was pushed especially by Christian IV of Denmark, and hundreds of people were burned after being found guilty of witchcraft. When James VI of Scotland, who was as interested in witch trials as the Danish king, traveled to Denmark in 1590 to see his fiancée, Anne of Denmark, more than 70 people in Scotland were accused of witchcraft due to unfavorable weather upon his return. In England, the Witchcraft Act of 1542 regulated the penalties for witchcraft, the preferred penalty being burning at the stake. Witch hunting reached its peak during the European Wars of Religion, between about 1580 and 1630. During this period, and in earlier centuries, the punishment for a person found guilty of witchcraft or sorcery usually consisted of either being burned at the stake or undergoing the ordeal of cold water. In this ordeal, those accused who floated were convicted of practicing witchcraft and were either burned at the stake or executed in an unholy manner. But those who drowned were deemed innocent and would be brought back, which means to have their names cleared by the church authorities. How merciful. An estimated 75 to 85% of those accused in the early modern witch trials were women, and there is certainly evidence of misogyny on the part of those persecuting witches. However, as already mentioned in part 1, witch hunts cannot be explained simplistically as an expression of male misogyny. There were many factors that led up to it, and it has been shown that many women were frequently accused by other women, to the point that witch hunts, at least at the local level of villages, have been described as having been driven primarily by women's quarrels. To the east of Europe, the Russian Orthodox Church took quite a different course towards so-called witchcraft. They viewed witchcraft as part of pagan beliefs, and not as a pact between witches and demons. They did not encourage people to spy on each other. However, the Orthodox Church still claimed it to be in direct opposition to Christianity, and requested Tsar Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, to outlaw it. Later, under the rule of Romanov, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, the death penalty for anyone found guilty of witchcraft was instituted. This was due to increased social and religious pressure. Even so, in stark contrast to Western Europe, far less people were tried for witchcraft, and the majority of the accused were men. From the late 16th century, clergy intellectuals began to speak out against witch trials, and by the mid-17th century, witch trials had begun to die out across most of Europe. To the west of Europe, however, across the Atlantic, in the newly formed colonies in America, the frenzy burned bright one last time.